It was tragedy on an extraordinary scale. A quake so powerful, it knocked the Earth off its axis. Tens of thousands dead. The whole of Japan shifted 3 meters out to sea. Parts of the coast dropped over a meter. What were the forces that came together to create this horrifying disaster? A team of scientists is investigating.
Never before have we had such a surplus of data. There are no mysteries in this earthquake. We know exactly what happened.
Japan's coast lies in ruins. Incredibly, it could have been even worse. This is the untold story of how science saved lives, and how scientists are piecing together exactly what happened. Professor Roger Billum is a world-leading earthquake expert. He's in Japan to witness the immediate aftermath.
So we're flying right over the coast right now, and much of the coast has sunk about a meter. The extent of the damage is truly amazing. The tsunami picked up everything in its path. Cars, houses, warehouses, and just tumbled them relentlessly inland, on and on and on. One of the things I'd like to see is exactly how far it went, what kind of debris gets left behind on these gigantic tsunamis.
Billum is the first geologist to conduct an aerial survey of the damage. Every detail of the disaster has been recorded by seismometers, strain gauges, and tidal gauges, allowing experts to analyze exactly what happened. But this was first and foremost a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. It ripped away much of Japan's infrastructure. One of the world's most developed nations brought to its knees. As rescue workers pick through the debris, Billum and other scientists around the world take on the challenge of understanding the massive earthquake in the hope of one day avoiding such loss of life. The source of the disaster lay 100 kilometers off the coast. Beneath 6 kilometers of water, the Earth was distorting. A vast, slow-motion collision. The Earth's crust is made up of several continent-sized slabs of rock, tectonic plates. Japan lies on a boundary between these plates. The Pacific plate is ramming into it at 8 centimeters a year, about the same speed your fingernails grow. The Pacific plate drives underneath it, snagging and catching as it goes. The plate that Japan sits on compresses and buckles under the strain. Over decades and centuries, immense stresses build up.
The energy that drove this earthquake had been building up for a couple of hundred years. It's caused by the movement of the Pacific plate towards the Eurasian plate. Think of it as a giant elastic band that's being wound up for 200 years.
On March the 11th, 2011, at 2:46 p.m. Japanese time, the stresses reached breaking point.
The amount of energy released in an earthquake of this size is really huge, and you have to measure it in large units. If you take the atomic bomb that devastated Hiroshima, this event was probably 2 million of those, a really huge amount of energy.
Shockwaves radiated out. The fastest known as P waves, traveled at 6 kilometers a second. Japan's detection systems picked them up instantly.
地震が来ます。
Within seconds, before anyone realized what was going on, automatic warnings flashed across the country. A computer-generated announcement even interrupted a Japanese parliament broadcast. By the time the warning system kicked in, the coastal city of Sendai, just 130 kilometers from where the earthquake originated, was shaking. The slower but more destructive shock waves, called S waves, had now arrived. These waves travel at 3 kilometers a second. They threw northeast Japan into chaos. As the shock waves raced outward, 150 kilometers southwest of the epicenter, they slammed past Fukushima Daiichi, an aging nuclear power station housing 6 reactors and generating 4.5 gigawatts of electricity for the local grid. This footage from a town near the reactor gives some idea of the earthquake's power. Japan's warning system had automatically shut down the reactors. Cooling them would take time.
When you think shutdown, you think, the danger's gone because it's shut down. But the reactor core was still extremely hot. You know, if you have a pan in the oven and you shut the oven off, that oven continues to heat inside even after you've turned it off.
After shutdown, emergency diesel generators kicked in to pump coolant through the reactor cores. Fukushima survived the earthquake intact, but there was one big problem. It stands just meters from the sea. 11,000 kilometers away at the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii, staff got emergency pager messages. Within 10 seconds of the earthquake starting, its effects were already being monitored around the world.
Japan has lots of seismometers, so there was a lot of information fast. So the earthquake was still going on when we got our page.
First indications, a magnitude of around 7. But as data flooded in, the figures started to climb. 7.5, 7.7, up into the 8s.
The immediate reaction of everybody was, that's not right. Because in the history of Japan, there has never been an earthquake larger than 8.4.
Really heightened the intensity of what we were doing, because we knew we were dealing with something very big and something that could affect the whole Pacific Basin.
We realized, oh, this is it. And then immediately you realize, this is horrible for Japan.
100 seconds since the fault line slipped. The slowest moving but most destructive S waves reached Tokyo.
Now, 東京渋谷のスタジオが非常に大きく揺れています。東京の渋谷のスタジオが大きく揺れています。
With 60 seconds warning, Tokyo was already braced. But not for this. The quake lasted an unprecedented 5 minutes. One American geologist was in the city that day.
We expected it to end after 10, 15, 20 seconds, something like that, maybe a minute at the most. About minute 3 or 4, we were just all kind of astonished that it just kept going and going and going.
What is different about a big earthquake is that it begins, but it doesn't stop.
We're just looking at each other going, is this over yet? And no, it's not. It's still going. It was kind of a growing realization that it was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it had to be fairly close.
In a nearby park, an American tourist found the ground opening up at his feet. No one has ever filmed this happening before. The footage reveals a characteristic of earthquakes: liquefaction. As the ground is compressed, water is squeezed and forced to the surface.
Okay, we have earthquake right now, and this is actually moving. Can you see the cracks moving? That crack was not there. The crack is getting bigger and smaller, going back and forth. And there is water coming up all over in the park right now. This and here's a huge crack, and it's still moving. It's just going back and forth, swaying. It's making me kind of nervous. This land could just go, potentially. I don't know.
In the days to come, scientists would regrade this quake as a magnitude 9. The warning systems worked, and most buildings were still standing. But even before the quake had finished, everyone in Japan knew worse was to come. There were only minutes before a tsunami would arrive. The question now was how many would escape in time. On March the 11th, 2011, the billions Tokyo had invested in quake-proof engineering and early warning systems proved their worth. They saved the city's structures and its people. Then, the tsunami struck. The tsunami was triggered by the explosive energy release of the earthquake, 100 kilometers off the coast. What caused it? Over centuries, the Japanese side of the tectonic fault line had been compressed and dragged downwards by the Pacific plate driving beneath it.
The whole upper plate behaves just basically like a rubber block. It just compresses, and like a spring like this, and when the earthquake happens, it springs back.
The sudden upward flip of such a huge slab of rock lifted a 6-kilometer deep mass of water upwards to the surface of the sea. As it collapsed back, immense waves raced out across the ocean. Not like normal sea waves, more like shock waves from an explosion. Just 1 meter high, but over 100 kilometers from front to back, and traveling at terrifying speed.
The energy heaved up the sea floor. That displaced vast amount of water that we can see made its way on land, it made its way off around the Pacific.